he's 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 all words YouTube frowns upon me using, so this is gonna go well. Joking aside, there are very few wrestlers who have quite the legacy that Sabu has, from taping up insane wounds and continuing with matches, to nowadays a very edgy Twitter follow. At the time of me writing this, Sabu is set to have his last ever match, ending his career which began 40 years ago. Just think about that for a second. This man here began wrestling 40 years ago. His last match is set to be against Joey Janela for Game Changer Wrestling over WrestleMania weekend. Sabu is one of those wrestlers who looks like he was tailor-made for ECW, and with that in mind, I wanted to take a look at a weird time in his career. In this video, we'll look at why Sabu left ECW, how he joined WCW, as well as his entire run there, including all of his matches, and what happened next. Sabu would arrive in ECW on October 1st, 1993, wrestling Taz, who was also making his debut. Earlier that year though, he'd wrestled a dark match for WCW, facing Mad Max Anthony. He had also had a brief run in USWA in Memphis, working as Samu against the likes of Jeff Jarrett, Brian Christopher, and a man he trained with called Rob Zakowski, better known as Rob Van Dam. In early 1995, Sabu had already won the ECW heavyweight title, television and tag team championships. In December 94, he had begun working for New Japan Pro Wrestling, and was beginning to work there regularly. Trouble would come in April though, when Sabu accidentally double booked himself between ECW and New Japan, and chose to skip Heyman's booking. As a result, at ECW 3-Way Dance on April 8th, Paul Heyman would come to the ring and publicly fire Sabu. Sabu's firing from ECW ended up being one of the top main stories in the Wrestling Observer that week. In the April 17th issue, Dave Meltzer might have uncovered the reason why Paul Heyman was so upset at Sabu missing the booking. The event that Sabu missed was called 3-Way Dance, and it was built around a 3-team match for the Tag Team Championships. Dave wrote that Heyman had been wanting to put together the freeway since Christmas, but a botched angle at one show, combined with schedule conflicts, combined with wanting to build it correctly, kept pushing the match back. The date was added for April 8th, because it was the only possible date at that point to assure that all 6 would be available. He adds that Paul Heyman said he gave Sabu the April 8th date on March 20th, while New Japan reportedly gave Sabu the date on March 21st, so the ECW booking had come in one day earlier. But you could argue that the Japan booking may have been more important to Sabu, as according to him, the bookings were to lead to an event on May 3rd, where he would win the IWGP Junior Heavyweight title from Koji Kanemoto. It seems though that there was a little more to Sabu choosing New Japan, as he seemed to be unhappy with ECW's trademark style. He also admitted that he's been unhappy with the current direction in ECW. In particular, undercard wrestlers using juice and chairs and brawling all over the building, feeling it detracts from when the main eventers do the same thing. And also, other wrestlers putting wrestlers through tables, which he felt was his personal gimmick. When speculating about where Sabu might land when he returned to the US, Dave said in his story that it's expected that Sabu will start working in the tri-state area for rival promoter Dennis Coraluzzo. During Sabu's next few months in New Japan, he would indeed, as planned, win the junior heavyweight title from Kanemoto at Wrestling Dontaku. The next month, he would make his only successful defense against Black Tiger, this version being Eddie Guerrero under the mask. 2 days later, he would lose the title back to Kanemoto. Sabu would continue to work regularly for New Japan throughout the rest of 1995, but never again for them. In 96, he would return to FMW, who he had worked for previously, and would also wrestle for BJW and All Japan. You might be wondering then how and why Sabu ended up joining WCW. The answer, put as briefly as possible, is Nitro. In the July 31st Wrestling Observer, we get our first report of WCW wanting fresh new talent ahead of their upcoming new live show. There's a lot of sentiment to putting on one classic match for 20 minutes every week, involving guys like Sabu, Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, Al Snow, Brian Pillman, etc. While some of these names were said to have been made offers, Dave notes that regarding Sabu, interest has been expressed. In the following week's issue, these acquisitions seemed even less likely. Having originally reported that they had made an offer to Al Snow, Dave corrects the record by saying that they told him he would receive an offer, but he never did, and so he joined WWE instead. Negotiations with Eddie Guerrero had also stalled, though he would end up joining in August. From the talent side, it seems that there wasn't much trust in WCW to do much with them. There has been concern expressed by several of the names above that WCW has been unable to get anyone over. Benoit's treatment when he was in WCW, along with the treatment of Brian Pillman and Steve Austin, who have been with the company for years and are two of the 3 or 4 best workers in the company, seemingly have had their careers go nowhere. By a couple of weeks later, it seemed that WCW had been able to secure the services of Sabu, along with Benoit, Guerrero and Dean Malenko, a sort of extreme radicals if you will. It appears that WCW did this by allowing all 4 to continue to work with New Japan, as well as US Indies, though the trade-off is that they couldn't work any dates for WWE, Smoky Mountain Wrestling or ECW. In the same issue, Dave expresses concern at how Sabu might be able to work once he gets to the company. Sabu is one of the most spectacular high spot performers in the world, but as the early mat portions of his New Japan matches show, he's not in the league of the other 3 as far as being a complete performer. ECW hid that generally by using him in situations that emphasized his strengths and camouflaged his weaknesses. We'll get a pretty good answer to that when we get to his WCW matches. On August 22nd, 95, Sabu would work his first night for World Championship Wrestling at a taping of Prime in Anderson, South Carolina. Sabu would wrestle 3 matches on the night, and as far as I can tell, only one of them would air on television, and I'll talk about that one when we get to it airing in the timeline. The other 2 matches were against Chris Kanyon, who himself had only just joined WCW in June, with one of those matches being a DQ loss for Sabu, and the other not being listed. According to the September 4th Observer, Sabu did 3 matches, 2 against Chris Kanyon. None of them will air on television, but will be used to put together a video to promote his debut on the September 11th Nitro show. Jimmy Hart was said to be impressed with Sabu's willingness to put his body on the line, and that's probably the key person in the organisation to impress for a new wrestler. Can you imagine somebody like Jimmy Hart being a fan of Sabu? Maybe show him Born to be Wired, please. I'd pay to see his reaction. On September 11th, 95, Sabu wrestled his first match on Nitro from Miami, Florida. In the opening match of the night, he faced Das Wunderkind, Alex Wright. The 2 waste no time at all, as the camera can't even catch up with them early on. From the opening bell, it takes all of 28 seconds before Sabu sends Wright to the outside. There's an audible gasp from the crowd as Sabu picks up a chair, but he uses it as a springboard to miss Wright and launch himself poetry in motion style at the guardrail. The 2 spend the vast majority of the match on the outside, with Alex Wright doing some impressive flying himself. After a victory roll from the top rope, Sabu gets the surprise pinfall victory, but post-match he continues attacking Alex. He sends him to the outside and brings out a table, which back then would have been far less common than we see them used today. In a rather dangerous looking fashion, Sabu long darts himself off the top rope and he and Wright crash through the table. This causes referee Nick Patrick to reverse the decision, so Wright would win by disqualification. Speaking in a January 2025 interview with Wrestling Life Online, Alex Wright said of this match with Sabu that he was pretty intimidated at the thought of wrestling him. I was a little bit nervous, because he's a really crazy guy, but when I actually got to meet him and talk to him, he was a really nice guy, and from that moment I said, oh, it's gonna be fine. Frankly, who could blame Alex for not knowing what he might get before he met Sabu? The next time Sabu would be seen by WCW fans would be the September 25th edition of WCW Prime, which was the match taped in August that I mentioned earlier. Sabu faces Harry New Baker, a wrestler whose name brings up absolutely nothing if you Google him, bar a certain famous dentist. They show early on that Harry doesn't know what to make of Sabu, as he struggles to do much more than evade Sabu diving at him, and is taken down quickly. While we see Sabu do more holds than we're used to, he still hits many of his springboard dives. He even rather impressively manages to head scissors Harry over the top rope. Sabu hits the Arabian Press, which is a moonsault springing off the top rope, similar to Rob Van Dam's split-legged moonsault. Perhaps expecting Sabu to vault over onto the apron, the camera almost misses Sabu bouncing back into the ring. They never quite get the hang of this, as the camera would nearly miss the move in every Sabu match going forward. Granted, that's not many more chances. In the September 25th Observer, Dave tells of plans for Sabu's pay-per-view debut, Halloween Havoc. The event was set to take place in Detroit, where his uncle famously wrestled, then promoted. Sabu's opponent on the October 29th Detroit pay-per-view will be Jerry Lynn. WCW also attempted to get Bobo Brazil to be in whoever's corner, since Brazil and the Sheik, who will be in Sabu's corner, had probably the biggest feud ever in Detroit. Brazil, who needs a walker, turned WCW down, saying he's retired from the wrestling business. He also notes that Sabu is working on severe back and shoulder injuries. In the same newsletter, Dave notes that Alex Wright vs Sabu was scheduled for the October 2nd Nitro, though this wouldn't take place. He also notes that Sabu's next match after that was set to be against future ECW World Champion Jerry Lynn on the October 9th Nitro, and this match would take place, but not the Jerry Lynn you might know from ECW. Sabu would face Mr. JL, a short-lived Power Rangers inspired gimmick. Before we get to that, here's an interesting note from the October 2nd Observer, which relates to the meeting between Sabu and Eric Bischoff, which took place on the night of Sabu's Nitro debut. The big joke going around is that when Eric Bischoff met Sabu at the Miami tapings, he brought up having grown up in Detroit and watched his uncle wrestle, and then talked about seeing his uncle lose the title to Hulk Hogan, confusing the Sheik with the Iron Sheik. The reason he miscalled Sabu's finisher as the Arabian Press is because Sabu told Bischoff the finisher would be the Arabian Press. However, Nick Patrick counted the 3 on a move that wasn't supposed to be the finish. In the same issue, Dave adds an interesting note that conveys that Sabu might not have been too happy in New Japan at this time either. Sabu wants to bring the Sheik's old Detroit US title, which Sheik used to bring to FMW as recently as a few years ago to feud with Onita over, and claim it and feud with Sting over the rightful US champ in November. Sabu is attempting to do anything to break him out of the junior heavyweight typecast, and limitations in money and push that label brings, further compounding any negative feelings between Heyman and Sabu. At the ECW show on October 6th, the show opened with Heyman addressing the crowd again. Heyman said that Sabu was welcome back, but then instead on the 28th he was wrestling for the opposition, Dennis Coraluzzo's show in Woodbury, New Jersey, because he was mad that Raven, Stevie Richards and the Pitbulls broke so many tables in their match on the previous show. The table's explanation could be Paul keeping his storylines intact, as Sabu had in the past, in kayfabe, gotten mad at other wrestlers for using tables, considering them to be his thing. But then, as noted earlier, he also seemed to think that in real life as well. On October 9th, 95, on the 6th episode of Nitro from Rosemont, Illinois, Sabu would have his match with Mr. JL. At nearly 4.5 minutes, this would be by quite a way the longest match Sabu would have in WCW. Before I get into the match, this is completely pointless, but during Mr. JL's entrance, there was a Justin Roberts signing in the crowd. What follows is a really fun cruiserweight match, with lots of flying around from both wrestlers. One thing that caught my eye though, was that every time Sabu would point to the sky as he did in all of his matches, the referee would look up to see what he was pointing at. Every time he did that. Countering a dive from JL into a powerbomb, Sabu would apply the camel clutch and win the match. Post-match, Sabu throws JL to the apron and nearly botches a sunset flip powerbomb to the outside. The referee prevents him from doing any more damage as we cut back to the announcers. According to the October 16th Observer though, Sabu used a table on the outside and the cameras didn't cover it. When we cut back to the ring, Sabu and Jerry Lynn are gone and Sting and Lex Luger were in for an interview. The next time that Sabu would appear on WCW television would be quite possibly his first ever match on pay-per-view. At Halloween Havoc 1995 from Detroit, Michigan, Sabu would face Mr. JL again, only this time he would be accompanied by his uncle. As soon as Sabu slides into the ring, knowing that he usually goes on the attack straight away, JL beats him to it. Once again, within seconds the two are fighting on the outside. As Sabu flies towards the entranceway with an Asai moonsault, the Sheik, who is standing right behind Lin, didn't know it was coming, and both Sabu and Lin crash into him. In a 2023 interview with Title Match Wrestling, Sabu would explain that the Sheik, who already needed a cane to walk, suffered a broken leg from that moonsault. According to Sabu, he would never get the surgery to get it fixed. He had a hip replacement, so I didn't break his leg, I broke his hip replacement. He'd had it done twice, but he would have to have it done a third time, but he died before that. This match feels not as well planned as the first one, as the two seem to be tethered to this particular corner of the ring. Sabu gets the win in a couple of minutes, and post-match, the Sheik throws a fireball at Mr. JL that the cameras almost completely miss. Speaking at a 2024 interview, Jerry Lynn confirmed that Sabu had not told the Sheik about the moonsault, so he had no idea it was coming. On the fireball at the end, Lynn said, "After the match was done, I didn't even know. I'm laying there by the ropes and all of a sudden, I feel all this heat and see a bright flash go across my face. At first I didn't realise what it was." Lynn goes on to explain that backstage Kevin Sullivan was furious, but Lynn hadn't known about it beforehand, or that the Sheik had been told not to do it. Given that this was the Sheik's last public appearance on US soil, with his last being a retirement ceremony organised by FMW, Jerry Lynn became the last person to take a fireball from the original Sheik. On the day before Halloween Havoc, Sabu had his Northeastern return for the Dennis Coraluzzo promoted show, where he wrestled a nearly 27-minute match with Devon Storm, who would go on to be Crowbar in WCW. According to The Observer, Sabu and Devon Storm must have torn the house down at the NWA show on October 28th, in Woodbury, New Jersey, before 625 fans. We received more calls about this match than any indie match in recent memory, with nobody rating it less than 4.5 and most giving it 5 stars, with many long-time area indie fans saying it was the best match they'd ever seen live. Dave also adds that Sabu had talked with Paul Heyman the day before, though not about returning to ECW anytime soon. Sabu would have just one more match on Nitro, and that would take place the night after Halloween Havoc in Dayton, Ohio. He would face Disco Inferno, though a much more interesting match had been planned. The November 13th Observer tells us there were a lot of complaints around town in the local newspapers and radio about the WCW Nitro taping on October 30th in Dayton, as 5 of the 7 scheduled matches didn't take place. Sabu was scheduled to wrestle Eddie Guerrero with the Sheik in his corner, but it never took place, with Guerrero instead replacing Randy Savage and wrestling Craig Pittman, and Sabu, without Sheik, replacing an injured Johnny B. Bad against Disco Inferno. After another 2-minute match where Sabu hits some of his dives, he surprisingly pins Disco with a somersault leg drop over the ropes. After the match, Sabu lays Disco out on a table and dives over the ropes, missing Disco, but the table does not break. Disco manages to run away before we cut back to the announcers, and the last we see of Sabu in WCW is him throwing the ring steps around in a fit of anger. On November 18th, 1995, ECW presented November to Remember. After the first match of the night, Paul Heyman would get in the ring and promise the fans a surprise. The lights would go out in the ECW arena, and when they came back on, Sabu was standing in the ring and would hug Paul Heyman. Later on, in the semi-main event of the night, Sabu would wrestle Hack Myers, defeating him in a 12-minute match, longer than almost all of his WCW screen time combined. While the ECW fans were very happy on this night, it seems that World Championship Wrestling might not have been, as they did not know that Sabu had taken the booking until it happened. WCW had been upset with Sabu for numerous reasons, such as him brawling out of the ring more than they wanted him to, and going longer than scheduled in some television matches. According to Sabu himself, he found out that he'd been fired watching the November 20th episode of Nitro, and hearing a tease for their hotline regarding a star that had been released. He then called the hotline, only to hear Mike Tenay reporting on his firing. Dave also notes that Sabu was still being advertised for upcoming matches on the upcoming World War III pay-per-view, as well as a match with Eddie Guerrero on the December 11th Nitro. From the time that Sabu joined WCW, many in the Observer's letter pages feared that he would be penned in with the other cruiserweights, and that very well might have happened had he stayed. In both WCW and New Japan, Sabu expressed a desire to not be considered a lightweight worker, for fear that he would become a perennial mid-carder. Throughout the time that I've covered in this video, Sabu had also been working for AAA in Mexico, and was seen there as a top heel for the promotion, and so who could blame Sabu for not seeing a reason why he couldn't be a top star elsewhere. After returning to ECW, he would become the world champion again, as well as a tag team champion twice with Rob Van Dam, and unofficially the FTW champion, which was Taz's own property rather than a sanctioned title. He would go on to have an extensive career, wrestling everywhere and anywhere. He would even have a run in WWE, including a bizarre match with John Cena, which nearly 20 years later still doesn't feel like it should have been a thing at all. Sabu is truly one of a kind, and frankly should be remembered more as one of wrestling's greatest loose cannons. Thank you for watching yet another wrestling channel. If you enjoyed this, please comment, like or subscribe.